All right, let's dive right in. Today's explainer covers what is undeniably the most destructive, expansive conflict in the entirety of human history. We are talking about a complete global collapse, unimaginable devastation, and massive ripple effects that completely rewired the entire world, including the Indian subcontinent. We're going to map out exactly how a world that had literally just promised peace managed to descend into total absolute chaos.
But to do that, let's start near the end. Picture a perfectly ordinary morning. You've got people heading off to work, kids walking to school, the streets of Japan are just bustling with the normal routine of daily life. And then, suddenly, something falls from the sky. In mere seconds, that peaceful morning is completely shattered by a flash of blinding light. The ground violently shakes, a massive fireball just consumes the horizon, and hundreds of thousands of lives are lost in an instant. It literally looked as if the sun itself had crashed into the earth.
To really grasp the visceral horror of that exact moment, consider this. At the very center of that blast, temperatures spiked to between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. This was the first atomic bomb. And just 3 days later, on August 9th, a second catastrophic bomb dropped, unleashing a whole new wave of devastation. This unprecedented show of power is what finally forced Japan to lay down its arms and end the war. But, as you can imagine, it left an incredibly scarred world behind.
It's a genuinely staggering reality to process, and looking at that apocalyptic ending forces us to ask a really critical question. How on earth did the world get here? I mean, just 2 decades prior, humanity had barely survived World War I, which everyone was calling the war to end all wars, so what could possibly trigger an even deadlier global inferno so quickly? To figure that out, we have to rewind the clock and look at the actual foundation they built right after that first war.
Section 1. Seeds of the Second War. So, when the First World War wraps up, the victorious Allies essentially corner a defeated Germany with the Treaty of Versailles. France shares a border with Germany, they're terrified of future attacks, so they push for these incredibly harsh penalties. Germany is forced to sign a war guilt clause, basically taking the entire blame for the whole shebang. They get slapped with a staggering £6.6 billion in debt. On top of that, they lose 13% of their territory, massive chunks of their vital iron and coal resources, and they're forced to demilitarize the crucial Rhineland area. Meanwhile, the newly formed League of Nations, which was supposed to keep the peace, turns out to be completely toothless. So Germany is left fractured, humiliated, and absolutely desperate.
And that desperation quickly spirals into a total economic collapse. The Weimar Republic, which was Germany's government at the time, starts recklessly printing money just to pay off their debts. This kicks off a hyperinflation crisis so severe that people literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. Kids were playing with stacks of money like building blocks. The U.S. tried to step in and help with the Dawes Plan, but when the Wall Street crash hit in 1929, that aid vanished overnight. By 1932, a staggering 6 million Germans were unemployed, starving, and begging for any work they could find.
As tensions are mounting everywhere, geopolitical lines get drawn, splitting the globe into 2 massive camps. You've got the Allies, heavyweights like the UK, France, the USA, the Soviet Union, and China facing off against the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now what's really fascinating here is Italy. They actually fought with the Allies in the First World War, but when that war ended, the Allies completely ignored Italy's demands for territorial rewards. So feeling cheated and dealing with their own economic mess, a resentful Italy flips the script and joins Germany for round 2.
Section 2. Rise of the Dictator.
Enter Adolf Hitler. He was once an aspiring artist, but he completely capitalizes on the Great Depression and Germany's national humiliation. The guy was a master manipulator. He starts holding these massive rallies, delivering incredibly powerful speeches, promising to restore German glory and totally tear up the hated Treaty of Versailles. His popularity absolutely surges, leading President Hindenburg to appoint him chancellor in 1933. And almost immediately, Hitler pushes through the Enabling Act. This wasn't just a law, it was essentially the death of German democracy. It bypassed parliament completely, giving Hitler absolute dictatorial control and officially launched his fascist regime.
From there, his unchecked expansion is just incredibly methodical. In 1933, he yanks Germany out of the League of Nations. Fast forward to 1938, he marches troops back into the Rhineland and annexes Austria. Shortly after that, he just swallows up Czechoslovakia. But the real tipping point hits on September 1, 1939. Germany actually stages a fake attack. They dress their own soldiers in Polish uniforms to create a completely bogus excuse for war. Then they invade Poland, And since the UK and France had protective treaties with Poland, this aggressive deception finally forced their hands. 2 days later, they declare war on Germany.
Section 3. The global inferno ignites.
This becomes a total war, where civilians are targets and entire national economies are turned into weapons. And the sheer speed of it shocked everyone. Take the fall of France in 1940. Germany didn't even attack head-on. They cleverly bypassed French defenses, but just going straight through Belgium. At the exact same time, Italy attacks France from the south. By June 14th, Axis forces are literally marching through the streets of Paris, and France surrenders mere days later. This lightning-fast victory made Hitler look virtually invincible. He then turns his sights to Britain, relentlessly bombing them during the Battle of Britain, but the British forces stubbornly hold their ground and survive the onslaught. While Britain is holding the line, the conflict is spreading like wildfire across the globe. The Soviet Union, who actually started with a non-aggression pact with Germany, swallows half of Poland and annexes the Baltics and Finland. Germany secures critical iron ore shipments by seizing Denmark and Norway. The Axis powers then lock in their terrifying alliance with the Tripartite Pact, and then the conflict spills right into the Pacific. Japan launches a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, awakening a sleeping giant and dragging the United States of America directly into the war.
Section 4. The fatal mistakes. So, by 1941, the Axis powers seemed completely unstoppable. They control much of Europe and are expanding aggressively everywhere. But, as we see time and time again, history is often turned by hubris. Which brings up a really vital question for you to ponder. At the absolute peak of his power, when he had Europe in a stranglehold, what fatal mistake did Hitler make that ended up costing him the entire war?
Well, he got greedy. He broke his own non-aggression pact and launched Operation Barbarossa right into the Soviet Union. The initial German blitzkrieg pushed aggressively east, totally expecting a quick, easy victory. But reality was waiting for them, and that reality was the brutal, freezing Soviet winter. The German army was completely unprepared for sub-zero temperatures. And the resilient Red Army, they didn't just stop the Germans, they pushed them back mile by bloody mile all the way to Berlin. Caught between the Soviets in the east and the British and Americans pushing from the west, the Nazi regime totally collapsed, culminating in Hitler taking his own life in a bunker.
Section 5. Aftermath in India's struggle.
Now, before we talk about what happened next, we absolutely have to acknowledge the unprecedented human cost of this conflict. Between 60 and 80 million people lost their lives. Think about that scale. 50 million of those were everyday civilians and 25 million were soldiers. Entire cities were just leveled, economies were completely ruined, and humanity witnessed atrocities on a scale never before seen. To this day, it remains the deadliest conflict in human history.
But buried amidst those staggering global numbers is a massive contribution that gets overlooked way too often. Because India was under British rule at the time, it was automatically pulled straight into the Allied war effort. Over 2.5 million Indian soldiers fought against the Axis powers. 87,000 Indian troops made the ultimate sacrifice and died. Over 34,000 were heavily wounded, and more than 67,000 were taken as prisoners of war. The blood of Indian soldiers was spilled on battlefields all over the world to help secure that Allied victory.
And you know, the sacrifice wasn't just happening on the battlefield. It was deeply systemic back home, too. The economic reality was incredibly stark. While the British war economy was absolutely booming, fueled heavily by its colonies, the Indian economy was just being drained. Vital raw materials like jute and cotton were constantly being exported out to Britain. Even more devastating, life-saving Indian grain was heavily exported to feed British soldiers fighting abroad, which caused massive, critical local shortages in India. Laborers were still being paid in cash wages, sure, but the lack of actual food in the local markets made that money completely useless. You couldn't eat cash.
And that economic drain directly resulted in this devastating number. 3 million. 30 lakh Indian civilians perished. Not from bombs, not from bullets, but from starvation and disease during the horrific 1943 Bengal famine. Because resources were so aggressively diverted to sustain the British war effort overseas, the most vulnerable citizens back home ended up paying with their lives. It's a staggering toll demanded from the Indian population.
When the dust finally settled on all this, the geopolitical map of the world was completely rewritten. We saw the rise of the USA and the USSR as the new global superpowers, which instantly kicked off the tensions of the Cold War. Germany was physically split right down the middle into East and West, and to try and prevent this nightmare from ever happening again, the United Nations was created from the ashes of the old League of Nations. But perhaps most significantly, the extreme financial and military exhaustion of the European empires meant they could no longer maintain their iron grip overseas. This drastically accelerated the end of colonialism and imperialism across Asia and Africa.
Which leads us right here, August 1947, independence. Britain, severely weakened both financially and militarily by the global inferno of World War II, simply no longer had the resources or the manpower to suppress the massive, surging demands of the Quit India movement. The sheer devastation of the war overseas acted as a direct, undeniable catalyst for liberation at home.
So this leaves us with an incredibly heavy, complex price of history to reflect on. When we look back at the millions of soldiers who fought and the millions of civilians who starved, did the global war for freedom ultimately cost millions of Indian lives to secure our own? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this explainer today. Keep questioning and keep learning.